Namaste. This week's issue of Organiser opens with a striking visual and even sharper message. Glass ceiling continues. It is not just a headline in very simpler words. It is a diagnosis of Indian democracy system and how the opposition is taking advantage of it. What we are witnessing is not merely the failure of a bill in the parliament, it is the continuation of a long political pattern where reform is accepted in principle but resisted when it comes to real implementation. As we begin today's episode of Organiser This Week, we are not just going through the magazine, we are unpacking a story that sits at the intersection of politics, power, gender and democratic representation. The editorial in this issue sets the tone with clarity and conviction. It reminds us that the idea of women's reservation is not new. It has been debated, discussed and deferred for nearly 3 decades. But what stands out in this movement is a contradiction that defines Indian democracy today. Women participate in elections in large numbers. In many states, they even vote more than men. They shape outcomes, they influence mandate. And yet, when it comes to representation inside the legislatures, their presence remains disproportionately low. The editorial by Shri Prafulya Ketkar argues that this gap is not accidental, it is very much structural and more importantly, it is political. It traces how from the very beginning, objections to the Women's Reservation Bill has often been framed as procedural or technical, but at their core, they reflect a deeper reluctance to redistribute political power. What is particularly interesting is how the editorial dismantles many of the arguments used to delay the bill. Whether it is a demand for sub-quotas, the north-south divide or concerns around delimitation. These are presented not as genuine constitutional barriers but as tools that have repeatedly been used to stall the progress. And yet, despite this resistance, the editorial ends with a sense of inevitability. It reminds us that Indian society has never lacked examples of women excellence in leadership, governance and decision-making. The Constitution has already given equal rights. What remains is the political will to translate those rights into representation. The glass ceiling, it says, continues, but it will eventually shatter. From here, the magazine moves into the cover story, which becomes the central narrative of this entire issue. Titled Freezing the Catalyst Reform, the article presents the Women's Reservation Bill as a transformative reform that has once again been halted at the last moment. The story begins with a fundamental observation that women in India are not passive participants in the democratic process. They are active, decisive and increasingly influential voters. But this electoral strength has not translated into legislative power. And this mismatch, the article argues, weakens the very foundation of this democratic system in India. The cover story then takes us through the long and turbulent journey of the bill. Starting from its first introduction in the year 1996, it recounts how successive attempts under different governments failed due to the lack of consensus, political resistance and strategic obstruction. What emerges is not a story of disagreement over principles, but a story of hesitation when reform threatens existing power structures. One of the strongest claims made in this space is that the opposition to the bill has often come from parties that publicly support women's empowerment, but privately they resist changes that could alter their internal power dynamics. This contradiction becomes even more visible when we look at the events of 2026. This article carefully explains the significance of the amendment that was brought forward this year. The government's proposal was not just about reservation, it was about enabling implementation within a realistic time frame. By proposing to use the 2011 census data and increasing the number of Lok Sabha seats, the amendment attempted to remove the biggest bottleneck, the delay caused by waiting for a new census and delimitation process. This was not a very simple legislative tweak, it was a calibrated reform. It ensured that no existing member of parliament would lose their seat. It maintained the balance between states and at the same time, it created space for women's representation to expand even further. And yet, despite the careful design, the amendment failed. What follows in the cover story is perhaps the most important insight. The failure of the bill is not just about numbers in the parliament, it reveals a deeper pattern in Indian politics, where there is a broad agreement on reform when it is a distant and abstract, but resistance when it comes immediate and real. The consequence of this failure is very much clear. Women's reservation, which could have been implemented by the 2029 elections, is now likely to be pushed to 2034 or even beyond. But the article goes further. It says that this delay is not just a missed opportunity, it is a continuation of a systematic imbalance that has existed for decades. As the narrative deepens, the magazine brings in a more analytic perspective through the piece on structural reservations versus pragmatic representation. This section adds a legal and constitutional layer to the discussion. It explains that the challenges around women's reservation are not rooted in a single disagreement. Instead, they arise from a combination of structural issues that are demands for subcategorization, concerns about constituency rotation, and the complex relationship between reservation and delimitation. The numbers presented here are telling. Women make up only a small percentage of parliament and state assemblies, placing India far below the global average. And yet, at the grassroots level, where reservation has already been implemented through Panchayati Raj institutions, the results have been transformative. This contrast is crucial. It shows that reservation is not just a symbolic measure, it has a real measurable impact on governance, priorities, and outcomes. The narrative then shifts into one of the most intellectually engaging pieces in the issue, an analysis of what it calls rhetorical posturing. This section takes a closer look at the arguments made during the 2026 debate, particularly the demand to de-link reservation from delimitation. At first glance, the demand appears reasonable. Why wait? Why not implement reservation immediately? But the article dismantles this argument by exposing its practical implications. Without delimitation, implementing reservation would require randomly selecting constituencies and displacing sitting MPs. It would create chaos within the system. And more importantly, it is something that no political party is realistically prepared to accept. This is where the article makes a sharp observation. Some political positions are not designed to be implemented. They are designed to sound morally correct while being practically unworkable. And in that sense, the failure of the bill becomes not just a legislative outcome, but a reflection of political strategy. Well, this issue then takes us to a more direct tone with the opinion piece titled Senseless Sabotage. Here, the argument becomes even more assertive. It says that the opposition to the bill has not only delayed women's representation, but also affected broader democratic balance, including representation of other communities. It raises an important governance question. India's population has more than doubled since the number of parliamentary seats was last fixed, and yet representation has not been expanded. Increasing the number of seats, the article argues, is not just about reservation. It is about making democracy more responsible and accessible. From domestic politics, the magazine then moves to the global stage with the coverage of United Nations Commissions on the status of women. This section broadens the conversation, reminding us that the question of women's empowerment is not limited to India, it is a global issue. The discussion at the UN highlights the importance of access to justice, legal reforms, and institutional support. What emerges is a key insight, that rights on paper are not enough. What matters is the ability to access those rights in practice. And this connects us back to the central theme of the issue, that the representation is not only about numbers, it is about creating systems where women can participate fully and equally. The magazine also brings in its signature mix of political and cultural analysis through its coverage of West Bengal. Here the focus shifts to identity, electoral behavior, and the changing socio-political landscape. The idea that cultural identity is evolving, sometimes is contested ways, is explored through symbolic references. At the same time, the political mood is captured through interviews that reflect a growing sense of resentment rather than fear among voters. This adds another dimension to the issue, showing how questions of identity, governance, and representations intersect in different parts of the country. By the time we reach the end of this issue, one thing becomes very clear. This is not just a collection of articles, this is a coherent narrative about India at a particular moment in time. A moment where democracy is expanding in some ways but still constrained in others. A moment where reform is within reach but not yet realized. A moment where the promise of equality exists but its implementation remains incomplete. And at the center of this moment is simple but powerful question. Can a democracy truly fulfill its potential if half of its population remains underrepresented in its highly decision-making bodies? This issue does not just ask questions, it challenges us to think about the answer. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that while legislation may be delayed, social change really stops. The pressure builds, the demand grows, and eventually the system has to respond. This is the story of this week's Organizer, and that is the story we will continue to follow. Thank you so much for watching.